Imagine the following scene. A man kills his father on a dusty road. Years later, he marries his own mother and has children with her. When he finally discovers the truth about what he's done, he tears out his own eyes in despair. This story is over 2,500 years old. It was written by the Greek playwright Sophocles and shocked audiences in ancient Athens. But what does a Greek tragedy have to do with modern psychology? Why did this specific myth become one of the most well-known and controversial concepts in the history of psychology? Welcome to the channel. Today, we're going to dive deep into the story of how a mythological king named Oedipus became the key for Sigmund Freud to try to unravel the mysteries of the human mind. We'll explore not just what Freud thought, but what the myth really means, why it remains relevant today, and how you can identify Oedipal patterns in your own life, in your relationships, and even in the movies and series you watch. Get ready, because this journey will take us from ancient Greece to Star Wars, passing through the psychoanalytic couch. And by the end, you'll never look at your relationship with your parents the same way again. Before we talk about Freud, we need to understand the original story. The myth of Oedipus begins before he's even born. Laius, king of Thebes, and his wife Jocasta receive a terrifying prophecy from the Oracle of Delphi. Their son is destined to kill his own father and marry his own mother. Trying to avoid this horrible fate, Laius orders that the baby be abandoned on Mount Cithaeron with his feet pierced and bound together. That's where the name Oedipus comes from, which literally means swollen feet. But fate is relentless in Greek tragedies. A shepherd finds the child and takes him to Corinth, where Oedipus is raised by King Polybus and Queen Merope as if he were their son. Oedipus grows up believing he's a prince of Corinth, not knowing he was adopted. As an adult, Oedipus hears rumors about his origin and decides to consult the Oracle of Delphi. There, he receives the same terrible prophecy. He will kill his father and marry his mother. Desperate to avoid this fate and believing that Polybus and Merope are his real parents, Oedipus decides never to return to Corinth. He sets off in another direction, believing this way he'll escape the prophecy. And this is where fate shows its cruel irony. On the road, at a narrow crossroads, Oedipus meets an elderly man in a chariot. The man is arrogant, demands that Oedipus get out of the way. An argument begins, the confrontation escalates, and Oedipus, in a fit of rage, kills the man and his servants. This man was Laius, his biological father. The first part of the prophecy was fulfilled without Oedipus even knowing. Oedipus continues traveling and arrives at Thebes, a city terrorized by a monster, the Sphinx. This creature with the body of a lion, wings of an eagle, and face of a woman is blocking the entrance to the city, proposing a riddle to all who pass. Those who can't answer are devoured. The riddle is this: what walks on 4 legs in the morning, 2 at noon, and 3 in the evening? Oedipus, brilliant and insightful, solves the riddle. It's the human being. In infancy, we crawl on 4 supports. In adulthood, we walk on 2 legs. And in old age, we use a cane as a 3rd leg. The Sphinx, defeated, throws herself off a cliff. Thebes is free. As a reward for liberating the city, Oedipus receives the crown of Thebes in the hand of the widowed queen, Jocasta, in marriage. He becomes king and has 4 children with her. Years pass. Oedipus rules wisely. Thebes prospers. But then, a terrible plague strikes the city. Crops die, people fall ill, women can't have healthy children. Oedipus, desperate to save his people, sends his brother-in-law Creon to the oracle to discover the cause of the plague. The answer is shocking. The city is contaminated by an unpunished murderer. The murder of Laius, the previous king, is in Thebes, and until he's discovered and expelled, the curse won't be lifted. Oedipus, determined to find the culprit, begins an investigation. He is, after all, the king, and he wants justice. He consults the blind prophet Tiresias, who reluctantly reveals that Oedipus himself is the murderer he seeks. Oedipus becomes furious, accuses Tiresias and Creon of conspiracy. But gradually, through testimonies from shepherds and survivors, the truth emerges like a wound opening. The man he killed at the crossroads was Laius. The woman he married is Jocasta, his biological mother. His children are also his siblings. The prophecy was completely fulfilled, despite all efforts to avoid it. When Jocasta comprehends the truth, she hangs herself. Oedipus, finding his mother-wife's body, tears the brooches from her dress and pierces his own eyes. Why? Why the blindness? because Oedipus finally sees the truth. He lived blind his entire life, not knowing who he really was. Now that his mental eyes are open to the horrible reality, he can no longer bear to see the physical world. Literal blindness becomes a symbol of inner vision. Oedipus leaves Thebes as a blind beggar, accompanied only by his daughter Antigone, carrying with him the curse he's borne since birth. This is the story, brutal, tragic, inevitable. And this was the story that captured Sigmund Freud's imagination in the late 19th century. To understand why Freud became obsessed with this specific story, we need to go back in time. We're in Vienna, capital of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, late 1890s. The Victorian era is at its peak, and with it, unprecedented sexual and moral repression. People didn't talk about sex. Decent women supposedly felt no sexual desire. Children were seen as pure, asexual, innocent beings. Freud was a young Jewish neurologist trying to understand why so many of his patients, especially women, suffered from physical symptoms without apparent medical cause, paralyses, blindnesses, convulsions. He began to suspect these symptoms had psychological, not physical, origins. And even more shocking, he began to believe many of these problems were rooted in repressed sexual conflicts. Freud was searching for universal patterns. He didn't just want to understand individual cases. He wanted to discover laws of the human psyche that would be valid for all people, everywhere, in all times. He was, essentially, trying to do with the human mind what Newton had done with physics, find universal laws of functioning. And this is where the myth of Oedipus enters. Why did Freud choose specifically this story? First, because Greek myths had, at that time, enormous cultural prestige. They were seen as expressions of deep and eternal human truths. Using a Greek myth gave Freud's theory a kind of cultural legitimacy. He wasn't just making shocking claims about infantile sexuality, he was connecting these ideas to one of the greatest works of Western literature. Second, Freud saw in Greek myths something he called popular wisdom. For him, these stories survived for millennia because they touched deep psychological truths that people recognized intuitively, even if they couldn't consciously articulate them. A crucial moment happened in 1897. Freud was in self-analysis, a courageous and radical process in which he applied his own psychoanalytic techniques to himself, exploring his dreams, his memories, his repressed impulses. In a letter to his friend and colleague Wilhelm Fliess, Freud wrote about a discovery that shook him. He realized that in his childhood, he had ambivalent feelings toward his father and special affectionate feelings for his mother. He began to wonder, do all boys go through this? And then he had his insight moment. The story of Oedipus isn't just a tragedy about fate, it's a symbolic representation of something that happens in all families, with all children. Sophocles' play only works, only moves audiences for 2,000 years, because we all recognize something true in it, something that's inside us. Freud was proposing something scandalous. Small children have sexual desires. These desires are directed, in the early years of life, at their own parents. And these desires need to be repressed, redirected, transformed for the child to develop normally. When this process fails, neuroses emerge, psychological problems that can last a lifetime. You can imagine the reaction. Freud was called a pervert, crazy, a degenerate. But he persisted, and the Oedipus complex became the cornerstone of his entire psychoanalytic theory. So what exactly is the Oedipus complex in Freudian theory? Let's unpack this carefully, because there are many misunderstandings about the concept. Freud proposed that approximately between 3 and 6 years of age, the child enters a specific phase of psychosexual development that he called the phallic stage. In this phase, the child's main erogenous zone, the area of the body that generates pleasure, concentrates on the genital organs. But attention, when Freud talks about sexual in children, he's not talking about adult sexuality. He's talking about a life energy, a search for pleasure and connection, something much broader and more primitive. In this phase, according to Freud, the little boy develops an intense attachment to his mother. She's the source of comfort, nourishment, affection. She's the child's first love object. And here's the controversial part. Freud believed this love begins to have shades of possessive desire. The boy wants his mother's exclusive attention. But there's a problem. There's a rival. The father. The father also has the mother's attention. The father sleeps in the same room as the mother. The father has an intimacy with the mother that the child doesn't have. And so, according to Freud, a rivalry is born. The little boy begins to see the father as a competitor, someone who needs to be overcome or removed. This is where the most controversial part of the theory comes in: castration anxiety. Freud believed that the boy, upon discovering that girls don't have penises, concludes they were castrated. He then develops an unconscious fear that the father, perceiving the rivalry, might castrate him too as punishment. This fear is so powerful that it forces the child to resolve the conflict. How? Through a process called identification. Unable to compete with the father and afraid of the consequences, the boy gives up conquering the mother and instead begins to identify with the father. If I can't beat him, I'll become like him. The child internalizes the characteristics, values, attitudes of the father. This is how, according to Freud, the superego is formed, the moral instance of the psyche, the internal voice that says what's right and wrong. The Oedipus complex is resolved when the child renounces the desire for the mother, accepts that she belongs to the father, and channels his energy in other directions: friendships, school, hobbies, and eventually, in adolescence, to romantic partners outside the family. And what about girls? Freud had a parallel theory, but it was Carl Jung, another psychoanalyst, who gave it the name Electra complex. According to Freud, the girl initially is also attached to the mother, but then develops what he called penis envy. She realizes she doesn't have the organ that boys have, blames the mother for it, and transfers her affection to the father. The mother becomes a rival. Eventually, the girl identifies with the mother, internalizing the feminine role as it was understood at the time. It's important to say, this part of Freud's theory about girls is even more controversial and has been widely criticized, including by later female psychoanalysts who saw in it reflections of the sexism of the era. But the central point remains: Freud was saying that all of us go through an intense psychological drama in early childhood. A triangular drama involving ourselves, the mother, and the father. And the way we resolve this drama determines much about who we become as adults. If the Oedipus complex isn't well resolved, Freud believed this could lead to all kinds of problems: difficulty establishing healthy relationships, authority problems, neuroses, even inappropriate choices of romantic partners. But was Freud right? Does this theory really apply to all people? Is this pattern universal, or just a reflection of 19th century European Victorian culture? We'll explore these questions, but first, we need to understand the symbolic layers of the myth itself. What's brilliant about the myth of Oedipus is that it works on multiple levels. Freud focused on a specific aspect, but the story is much richer than just repressed sexual desires. Let's explore some of these symbolic layers. First layer: Oedipus didn't know. This is the crucial point that's often forgotten. Oedipus didn't consciously kill his father. He didn't marry his mother knowing who she was. He did all of this without knowledge, without intention, and this is fundamental to the concept of the unconscious. Freud used the myth to illustrate that there are forces within us that operate outside our awareness. We do things, make decisions, feel attractions, develop aversions, all influenced by factors we don't perceive. The unconscious is always working behind the scenes of our psychic life, just as fate was working in Oedipus's life. Second layer: blindness. Oedipus spends the entire story blind to the truth about himself. He's the smartest man in Thebes, capable of solving the Sphinx's riddle, but he's completely unable to see who he really is. The prophet Tiresias, who is physically blind, sees the truth. Oedipus, who has perfect eyes, is psychologically blind. When the truth is finally revealed, Oedipus tears out his own eyes. Why? Because now he finally sees clearly. Outer vision becomes unnecessary, even unbearable. It's a powerful symbol of self-knowledge. Sometimes, seeing who we really are is so painful, we'd prefer to remain in darkness. This is, by the way, a perfect metaphor for the therapeutic process. Many people enter therapy wanting to solve a specific problem, but resist when they begin to discover uncomfortable truths about themselves. Self-knowledge has a price. Third layer: the search for truth that destroys. Oedipus is relentless in his investigation. Even when Jocasta begs him to stop, to not keep asking questions, he persists. He needs to know the truth, sort of whatever the cost. And the truth destroys him. There's something deeply human in this. We're the species that asks questions. We want to know. But sometimes knowledge is a curse. Once you know something about yourself, about your family, about your past, you can't unsee it. You can't return to the previous innocence. Fourth layer, fate versus free will. The myth poses a fundamental philosophical question. Are we free or determined? Laius and Jocasta try to avoid the prophecy by abandoning the baby. Oedipus tries to avoid it by fleeing Corinth. But every decision they make to escape fate leads them directly to it. It's as if the more you try to avoid your destiny, the more you fulfill it. From a psychological perspective, this can be read like this. We're determined by forces we don't completely control. Our genetics, our childhood, our traumas, our unconscious patterns, all of this pushes us in certain directions. Do we have some free will? Yes, but it operates within limits. And sometimes, our attempts to escape our patterns only reinforce them. Fifth layer, the Sphinx and the riddle. The Sphinx represents mystery, the unknown, that which blocks our path. The riddle it proposes is about human nature. What is the human being? Oedipus answers correctly on the literal level, but ironically, he doesn't know the answer on the personal level. He doesn't know who he himself is. The Sphinx can be seen as the guardian of the threshold, the one who tests whether we're ready to enter a new phase of life. Oedipus passes the intellectual test, but fails the test of self-knowledge. He can decipher external riddles, but not the riddle of his own identity. All these layers make the myth of Oedipus much more than a story about incestuous attraction. It's a story about consciousness, identity, fate, knowledge, and the price we pay for becoming who we are. And that's why the story continues to resonate, far beyond Freud's specific interpretation. The theory of the Oedipus complex was never universally accepted, not even among psychoanalysts. Since its formulation, it faced severe criticism from various directions. Let's explore the main ones. First critique: universality. Freud claimed the Oedipus complex was universal, something that happened in all cultures, in all times. But is it really? In the 1920s, an anthropologist named Bronislaw Malinowski went to study the Trobrianders, a people from the Pacific Islands. He discovered something fascinating. In that matrilineal society, where inheritance and name come from the mother, where the maternal uncle is the authority figure and not the father, children didn't demonstrate the pattern Freud described. Trobriander boys didn't see the father as a rival. Tension and rivalry existed, but were directed at the maternal uncle, the real authority figure. This suggested the Oedipus complex wasn't a universal law of the human psyche, but rather a specific pattern of Western patriarchal societies where the father is simultaneously the figure of love, protection, and punitive authority. Other anthropological studies confirmed different family structures produce different psychological dynamics. The Oedipus complex, as Freud described it, seems to be specific to a particular type of family organization. Second critique: gender bias. Feminist psychoanalysts, especially from the 60s and 70s onward, pointed out that Freud's theory about feminine development was deeply problematic. The idea of penis envy positioned women as deficient, as if something was missing in them. Freud's theory assumed having a penis was the standard, and not having one was a lack. Psychoanalysts like Karen Horney responded with the idea of womb envy, suggesting that perhaps it's men who envy the female capacity to generate life. But the bigger point is, Freud's theory reflected the gender prejudices of his time. It saw woman always in relation to man, never as a subject with her own unique development. Third critique: excessive literalness. Did Freud interpret the myth too concretely? Did he reduce a rich and symbolic story to just its sexual aspect? Many critics argue yes. By focusing only on the elements of patricide and incest, Freud missed the other layers of the myth. He didn't adequately explore the themes of identity, self-knowledge, fate versus choice. He took a complex myth and reduced it to a formula. Boy wants mother, sees father as rival. This reduction may have made the theory simpler and more scientific in Freud's eyes, but it also made it symbolically poorer. Fourth critique: the risk of pathologizing normal relationships by positioning the Oedipus complex as universal, and at the same time associating it with neuroses when unresolved. Freud created a trap. Suddenly, every normal relationship between parents and children could be seen through suspicious lenses. A boy is attached to his mother. Unresolved Oedipus complex. A girl is close to her father. Electra complex. This interpretation can lead to a distorted view where healthy family intimacy is pathologized. Parents begin to feel insecure about showing affection to their children. Therapists began to see Oedipus everywhere. The theory, instead of liberating, began in some cases to imprison. Fifth critique, excessive emphasis on the sexual. Even if we accept that there are triangular dynamics in the family, are they fundamentally sexual? Or did Freud, obsessed with sexuality as the driving force of the psyche, see sex where there were other things? Other theorists proposed that what's at stake isn't sexual desire, but issues of power, love, dependence, security. The child competes for the parents, attention not out of sexual desire, but out of need for care and validation. These are survival impulses, not sexual ones. Despite all these criticisms, it would be a mistake to completely discard the theory of the Oedipus complex, even if it's not universal in the way Freud thought. Even if it's culturally specific, it still captures something real about how we develop psychologically in certain family structures. And the myth of Oedipus, independent of Freudian theory, remains a powerful story about self-awareness and identity. There's a way to understand the myth of Oedipus that goes far beyond Freud's sexual interpretation. This approach sees the myth not as a literal description of infantile desires, but as a symbolic map of the development of human consciousness. Let's explore this reading. In this perspective, the myth of Oedipus represents the universal journey of a psychological separation from parents and construction of one's own identity. Each element of the myth is a symbol of a phase or aspect of this journey. Symbolically killing the father doesn't mean desiring the death of the literal father, but rather transcending the external authority that the father represents. When we're children, parents are gods. They know everything, can do everything, determine what's right and wrong. To become autonomous adults, we need to kill that absolute authority. We need to develop our own sense of right and wrong, our own choices, our own internal authority. This doesn't mean rejecting parents or everything they taught us. It means transforming the relationship from childish obedience and dependence to an adult recognition that we're separate from them, that we have our own path. Many people never complete this separation. They remain, psychologically, as children seeking parental approval even at 40, 50, 60 years old. They make decisions based on what they think their parents would approve of, not on what they themselves genuinely want. They never killed the father, in the psychological sense. In marrying the mother, symbolically, this can be understood as reconciliation with the inner feminine, with the unconscious, with the parts of ourselves that were rejected or repressed. The mother, archetypally, represents the unconscious, the receptive, the nurturing, the emotional. Marrying. The mother symbolically means integrating these qualities, not being trapped in them. It means recognizing and honoring the feminine within us, regardless of our gender, without being dominated by it. It means accessing creativity, intuition, emotional connection, qualities that are often repressed, especially in men in patriarchal cultures. The drama of the myth is that Oedipus does these things literally and unconsciously. He kills his real father without knowing, marries his real mother without knowing, and the result is catastrophe. The message? These transitions need to happen symbolically and consciously. When they happen literally and unconsciously, the result is destruction. Oedipus's blindness and subsequent vision represent the awakening of consciousness. Oedipus spends the entire story blind to his true identity. And when he finally sees, the shock is so great that he literalizes this seeing by tearing out his own eyes. But in physical darkness, he finally has psychological vision. He knows who he is. This is a metaphor for the process of individuation, of becoming who you really are. It requires courage. It requires looking at painful truths. It requires letting go of comfortable illusions about ourselves and our family. And yes, it's usually painful, but it's the only path to true psychological maturity. In this reading, the myth of Oedipus isn't about sex, it's about growth. It's about the journey of becoming a complete individual, separated from parents, but not alienated from them, aware of who you are, capable of taking responsibility for your own life. Every myth, in this perspective, is an archetypal pattern, a deep structure of the psyche that manifests in different ways in different cultures, but that touches something universally human. The myth of Oedipus doesn't need to be read literally to be true. Its truth is on the symbolic level. Here's something fascinating. Even if you've never read Sophocles or Freud, you've already encountered variations of the Oedipus myth dozens of times. Pop culture is full of Oedipal themes. Let's explore some examples. Star Wars is probably the most obvious example. Luke Skywalker's entire saga is structured around father-son conflict. Luke must confront Darth Vader, who is literally his father. But more than that, Luke must confront the possibility of becoming like his father, of falling to the dark side. Luke's journey is about overcoming paternal legacy, not through physical destruction of the father, but through his redemption. It's a version of the myth where the son kills the father by transforming him, by refusing to become what he was. And there are more layers. Luke was raised without knowing who his father was, just like Oedipus. There's a family secret, a hidden truth about his identity. When Luke discovers the truth and the Empire strikes back, I am your father, it's a moment as shocking as Oedipus's revelation. His identity is shaken. Everything he believed about himself, about his family, about his place in the universe, is suddenly questioned. He needs to integrate this new information about who he is. And like Oedipus, Luke initially tries to deny the truth, tries to reject it, but eventually must accept it and decide what to do with this knowledge. Game of Thrones gives us a more disturbing example. The incestuous relationship between Cersei and Jaime Lannister is a literal Oedipal transgression. They're twins who love each other romantically and sexually, an extreme violation of the incest taboo. But what the series explores is how this transgression contaminates everything around them. The children born from this union are fruits of a fundamental violation, and this manifests in their personalities and destinies. Joffrey, Aemond's the eldest son, is a sadistic monster who cannot empathize with others. Tommen is weak and easily manipulated. Myrcella dies young. The parents' transgression manifests in the psychological and physical destruction of the children. The show suggests that when fundamental boundaries are violated, when the incest taboo is broken, the result is corruption that spreads like a disease through generations. Psycho, Hitchcock's classic 1960 film, is practically a case study of the unresolved Oedipus complex. Norman Bates is an adult man completely dominated by the maternal psyche. He never managed to separate psychologically from his mother. When she died, he couldn't let her go. He mummified her body and kept her voice alive inside his own mind. The mother interior is so powerful that she takes control and commits murders. Norman is the extreme example of someone who never killed the father or mother psychologically, and therefore remains imprisoned, incapable of adult relationships or his own identity. He lives in a psychological fusion with the mother that prevents any possibility of genuine autonomy. When he's attracted to Marion Crane, the mother inside him murders her, unable to tolerate any rival for Norman's affection. Back to the Future has a hilariously disturbing Oedipal moment that plays the taboo for comedy. Marty McFly travels through time to 1955 and accidentally makes his teenage mother Lorraine fall in love with him instead of his future father George. He literally needs to make his parents fall in love to ensure his own existence. There's a memorable, uncomfortable moment at the school dance where Lorraine tries to kiss Marty and he's horrified. This is all wrong. I don't know what it is, but when I kiss you, it's like I'm kissing my brother. It's a way of exploring the incest taboo in a comedic manner, but the discomfort is real. The film makes us feel viscerally why this taboo exists. The underlying message: there are limits that shouldn't be crossed, even accidentally. Some boundaries are there for profound psychological reasons. In the world of anime, Neon Genesis Evangelion is deeply Oedipal on multiple levels. Shinji Ikari, the protagonist, has a complex and painful relationship with paternal and maternal figures. His father, Gendo, is emotionally distant, cold, and manipulative. He abandoned Shinji as a child and only calls him back when he needs him to pilot a giant biomechanical robot. Shinji desperately seeks his father's approval but never receives it. His mother Yui died when he was very young, absorbed into an EVA unit. Rei Ayanami, a mysterious girl for whom Shinji develops feelings, is eventually revealed to be a clone created from his mother's DNA. The series explores themes of searching for parental connection, fragmented identity, and the extreme difficulty of becoming a separate individual when parental relationships were traumatic or absent. It's Oedipus retold through giant robots, psychological horror, and apocalypse. Even in Disney movies, we find echoes of these themes. The Lion King is fundamentally about Simba dealing with his father's death and finding his place. Mufasa is the idealized, perfect father, wise, strong, loving. Scar is the shadow father, the dark, destructive aspect of paternal authority. Simba needs to integrate these two images, overcome the guilt for his father's death, even though it wasn't his fault, and assume his rightful place. Remember who you are is Mufasa's ghostly command, a message about identity and paternal legacy. Simba can't truly become king, can't truly become himself, until he confronts the truth about what happened, accepts his identity, and symbolically surpasses his father by taking his place. Why do these themes appear so often in our stories? Because, regardless of whether we agree with Freud's specific theory, family dynamics, the search for identity, the need for separation from parents, and the construction of autonomy are universal human experiences. All of us have to, somehow, negotiate our relationship with our parents, discover who we are separate from them, and build our own lives. The best stories touch these issues because they touch us at a deep level. When we see Luke confront Vader, or Simba return to Pride Rock, or even Marty desperately trying to avoid his teenage mother's kiss, we recognize something. We recognize the struggle for our own identity, the weight of family legacy, the fear of becoming like our parents, or the opposite fear of never being good enough like them. We recognize the need to separate while still honoring where we came from. Let's move from theory and mythology to concrete reality. How do Oedipal patterns, regardless of whether you accept the complete Freudian theory or not, appear in people's real lives? How do they affect relationships, career choices, and personal development? Let's explore some common patterns that therapists see regularly in their practices. First pattern: difficulty with psychological separation from parents in adulthood. This is extremely common and manifests in countless ways. Adults in their 30s, 40s, even 50s, who still make major life decisions based primarily on what their parents will think. It's not about respect or consideration, which are healthy and appropriate. It's about inability to act autonomously, a persistent need for parental approval that prevents authentic self-expression. Concrete example: a 35-year-old woman wants to change careers. She's been working in finance for 10 years because it was a practical choice that her parents approved of, but she's deeply unhappy. She's always wanted to be a writer, an artist, something creative. She has the savings to make the transition. She's researched the practical steps, but she can't pull the trigger. Why? Because she can't tolerate the idea of disappointing her parents, of hearing the worry in their voices, of no longer being the successful daughter they're proud of. Even though she rationally knows it's her life, not theirs, she feels paralyzed. She never completed the psychological separation. Parental approval is still more important than her own happiness and fulfillment. Or consider a man who wants to marry someone his parents disapprove of, perhaps for reasons of class, race, or religion, or simply because they don't think she's good enough. He loves this person deeply. They've built a life together, but he can't bring himself to commit fully, to stand up to his parents, to say, "This is my choice and you need to respect it." He's trapped in a dynamic where parental authority hasn't been internalized and transformed into his own values, but remains external and absolute. He's still the child seeking permission, not the adult making his own informed decisions. Completing the Oedipal separation, in this broad symbolic sense, means developing your own moral compass and identity. It means being able to disagree with parents without paralyzing guilt. It means being able to make decisions they may not like or understand, but that are right for you. This isn't adolescent rebellion, which is often just another form of being controlled by parents, only in reverse. It's mature adulthood, where you can consider your parents' input, value their experience, but ultimately trust your own judgment. Second pattern: choice of romantic partners who replicate characteristics of parents. This is fascinating and very common, often operating completely outside conscious awareness. How many times have you heard someone say in frustration, "I'm becoming my mother," or "I can't believe I married someone exactly like my father"? Freud would say this happens because our first models of love and relationship are our parents. They establish a pattern, for better or worse. And unconsciously, we tend to seek the familiar pattern because it's what we know. It feels like home, even if home is dysfunctional. Example: A woman whose father was emotionally distant and critical may find herself repeatedly attracted to emotionally unavailable men. Why? Because there's something familiar in it. Unconsciously, she may be trying to resolve the relationship with her father through a new relationship. If she can get this man to open up, if she can prove her worth to him, if she can finally get the validation she never got from her father, then symbolically she'll have corrected the original wound. She'll have healed the past. But of course, this rarely works. You can't heal childhood wounds through adult relationships that replicate the original dynamic. You only perpetuate the pattern. The emotionally unavailable partner remains unavailable. The validation never comes, and she finds herself stuck in the same painful dynamic over and over. Or consider a man whose mother was controlling and overprotective. He may marry someone with similar traits, unconsciously seeking the familiar dynamic. Or he may go to the opposite extreme and seek someone completely detached and uninvolved. In both cases, he's reacting to the maternal pattern, not choosing freely based on who he really is and what he really wants in a healthy partnership. Breaking this pattern requires awareness. It requires the ability to step back and ask, wait, am I being attracted to this person for healthy reasons? Or because they remind me of someone from my childhood? There's nothing wrong with feeling comfortable with the familiar, but when the familiar is dysfunctional, we need to consciously choose something different. Third pattern, rivalry with authority figures. Freud noticed that many of his patients had persistent problems with bosses, teachers, mentors, anyone in a position of authority. He interpreted this as the unresolved Oedipus complex manifesting itself in adult life. The original rivalry with the father transfers to other symbolic paternal figures throughout life. In practice, this looks like a man who can't accept criticism from his boss. Every piece of feedback, no matter how constructive, is felt as a personal attack. Every instruction is seen as undue control, an infringement on his autonomy. He's constantly in conflict at work, but not because he's incompetent. He's actually quite skilled. The problem is that he transfers unresolved feelings about his father onto his boss. He's still fighting the old battle. Or a woman who unconsciously sabotages any relationship with potential mentors. She asks for guidance and support, but then rejects all advice. She seeks approval and validation, but when she receives it, she finds reasons to disqualify it or distrust it. Underneath this pattern may be an unresolved dynamic with her mother, a mother who was perhaps competitive with her or who undermined her confidence even while claiming to support her. Resolving this pattern. Awareness, again, recognizing that not every authority figure is your father or mother, learning to discern between legitimate authority that deserves respect and collaboration and abusive authority that should be appropriately confronted. Developing the ability to receive feedback and guidance without automatically going into defense mode or seeing it as an attack on your worth. Fourth pattern, the importance of symbolically killing the father to become a full adult. This sounds violent and disturbing, but it's actually about psychological liberation. It means stopping living primarily to please parental expectations. It means taking full responsibility for your own life and choices. Many people reach their 40s, 50s, and suddenly realize they've lived the life their parents wanted for them, not the life they wanted for themselves. They chose the right profession, the one with status and security. They married the right kind of person, someone the parents approved of. They had the right number of children. They lived in the right neighborhood. They made all the choices that would make them the good son or the good daughter, and they're profoundly unhappy because they never asked themselves what they actually wanted. They never developed their own values, separate from their parents' values. They never discovered who they are underneath all those expectations. Symbolically, killing the father is this moment of rupture. It's when you finally say, no, this isn't my life. This is the life you wanted for me. I need to discover who I am, separate from your dreams and expectations. It's terrifying. It often comes with intense guilt, with fear of losing parental love and approval. In some families, it may even lead to temporary or permanent estrangement. But it's absolutely necessary for true individuation, for becoming a psychologically mature adult. And here's the beautiful paradox. When you complete this separation, when you kill the absolute parental authority and develop your own, you can often have a better and more authentic relationship with your real parents. Because now you relate to them as adult to adult, not as obedient child to all-powerful God. You can appreciate their strengths, understand their limitations, forgive their mistakes, all from a place of mature equality rather than childish dependence or resentful rebellion. Fifth pattern. Relationships where one partner assumes a parental role. This is extremely common and deeply problematic. One partner becomes the symbolic father or mother, making all the major decisions, controlling finances, giving or withdrawing approval and affection, dictating rules and expectations. The other partner assumes the role of symbolic son or daughter, dependent, constantly seeking approval, either obediently following the rules or rebelliously breaking them. This isn't a partnership between equals. It's a repetition of a parent-child dynamic transposed onto an adult relationship. And it's usually not healthy for either person. The person in the parental role may enjoy the control and feeling needed initially, but eventually resents having to take care of an adult as if they were a child. They feel burdened, exhausted by the responsibility. The person in the childish role may enjoy the security and not having to be fully responsible initially, but eventually feels suffocated, infantilized, unable to develop their own sense of competence and agency. Recognizing this pattern is the first step toward change. The second step is consciously working to establish a dynamic of mutual equality and respect. Both partners need to develop adult capacities. This may require couples therapy. It will definitely require difficult and honest conversations. But it is possible to transform these dynamics if both people are willing to do the work. All these practical applications demonstrate that, regardless of whether you accept the complete Freudian theory of the Oedipus complex with all its sexual implications, there's something genuinely real and important about resolving our psychological relationship with our parents. There's something true about the necessity of separation, individuation, and development of one's own authentic identity. And when this developmental task doesn't happen, when people remain psychologically fused with their parents, dysfunctional patterns repeat and repeat, often passing from generation to generation until someone finally has the courage to break the cycle. Let's talk about something fundamental that underlies all of this. Why is the incest taboo universal? Why do practically all human cultures, everywhere, in all times and places, prohibit sexual relations between close members of the same family? There are biological explanations, of course. Incest dramatically increases the risk of recessive genetic diseases and disorders. Children born from incestuous relationships have much higher rates of physical disabilities, developmental problems, and health complications. So it makes clear evolutionary sense that we would develop a deep instinctive aversion to incest. Natural selection would favor individuals and groups that avoided inbreeding. But the explanation isn't just biological, it's also deeply psychological and social. The anthropologist Claude Lévi-Strauss proposed that the incest taboo is actually the foundation of human culture itself. This is a fascinating and profound idea. How so? Think about it this way. If you could marry within your own family, if there were no prohibition against it, there would be no necessity to create alliances with other families. Each family would be a closed, self-sufficient unit, keeping all resources, all relationships, all connections within the bloodline. But by prohibiting incest, by forcing people to marry outside the family, you create social networks. You create alliances between different families, systems of exchange, cooperation across kinship groups. You create the fabric of society. The incest taboo forces exogamy, marriage outside the immediate group. And exogamy creates society in the fullest sense. It's the first step of an elaborate exchange system that goes far beyond the merely sexual exchange of goods and resources, exchange of knowledge and skills, exchange of protection and support, exchange of cultural practices. Civilization, in this profound sense, begins when you can't just stay with your own. You're forced to connect with others, to create relationships beyond your immediate family. But there's also a deep psychological function to this taboo. The incest taboo forces the child to psychologically leave the family nucleus. You can't find a romantic partner within the home. You need to go outside. You need to grow up, separate, become independent, establish your own household. The incest taboo is a powerful psychological push toward individuation, toward becoming a separate person. Without this taboo, there would be risk of psychological fusion, of non-separation, of remaining forever trapped in the original family dynamic, never developing your own independent identity. The taboo says, in effect, you need to leave. You need to find your own life, your own love, your own family. You cannot remain a child forever. It's interesting and important to note that when we talk about symbolic incest, we're talking about something different from literal incest, but deeply related. Symbolic incest is when someone remains psychologically trapped in family patterns, unable to leave emotionally and psychologically, even if there's no sexual relationship whatsoever. For example, a 40-year-old man who still lives with his mother, who has never had a serious romantic relationship, who spends all his free time with her, who makes her the center of his emotional life. Nothing sexual is happening, but there's a psychological fusion that's deeply problematic. He hasn't completed the necessary separation. He hasn't individuated. He's trapped in a kind of symbolic incest, a psychological enmeshment that prevents him from becoming a fully autonomous adult. Or consider a woman whose entire identity is completely intertwined with her father's identity and approval. She chooses her profession primarily to please him. She marries someone he approves of, someone who meets his standards. She lives where he wants her to live. She makes life decisions based on what will maintain his approval and avoid his disappointment. Again, nothing sexual is occurring, but there's a profound lack of psychological separation that is dysfunctional and that prevents her authentic development. The incest taboo, both literal and symbolic, exists to force us to grow up, to push us out of the comfortable nest, to make us discover who we are beyond our families of origin. It's uncomfortable. It's often frightening. But it's absolutely necessary for psychological health and maturity. And here's something fascinating about mythology and literature. In practically every mythological system, every literary tradition, incestuous relationships lead directly to disaster and destruction. Oedipus and Jocasta generate cursed children who eventually kill each other. In Norse mythology, incest between various gods results in monstrous offspring. In the Bible, Lot's daughters who become pregnant by their father generate nations that become enemies of Israel. The Greek gods engage in incest, and it leads to endless conflict and tragedy. The message across cultures is remarkably consistent. Transgressing this fundamental boundary brings catastrophe. Why? Because, symbolically understood, incest represents the collapse of necessary boundaries. It represents non-growth, fusion instead of healthy differentiation, regression instead of developmental progress. It represents refusal to enter the adult world with all its challenges and responsibilities. It represents remaining in the childhood world, avoiding the necessary separation that allows genuine maturity. So the incest taboo isn't just an arbitrary cultural rule, and it's certainly not just a biological imperative. It's a deep psychological and social structure that pushes us toward maturity, toward social connection beyond the family, toward creating something new instead of simply repeating and recycling the same. It is, in a genuinely profound sense, part of what makes us fully human. Let's return to the heart of the myth and what it teaches us. In the Temple of Apollo at Delphi, where Oedipus went to seek guidance about his origins, there was a famous phrase inscribed, "Know thyself." This injunction is absolutely central to Greek philosophy and Greek wisdom, and it's at the very center of the myth of Oedipus. Oedipus's tragedy is fundamentally a tragedy about the failure of self-knowledge. He's the smartest man in Thebes, perhaps the smartest man in Greece. He solves the notoriously difficult riddle of the Sphinx that no one else could solve, but he doesn't know who he himself is. He's completely blind to the most basic truth about his own identity, who his parents are, where he really came from, what he has actually done with his life. This is a powerful and unsettling metaphor for the human condition. How many of us are like Oedipus? Perhaps we're intelligent, competent, successful, capable of solving complex problems in the external world. We can decipher riddles, achieve goals, build careers. But when it comes to looking inward, to truly understanding our own motivations, our unconscious patterns, our deep wounds, our hidden fears, we're as blind as Oedipus was. It's always easier to see other people's problems than our own. It's easier to analyze the world than to analyze ourselves. Self-knowledge requires tremendous courage because it requires brutal, unflinching honesty. It requires being willing to see things about yourself that aren't pleasant, that don't fit your preferred self-image, that challenge the story you've told yourself about who you are. Oedipus, when the truth finally emerges after his relentless investigation, cannot bear it. Jocasta, his mother-wife, hangs herself when she realizes what has happened. Oedipus, finding her body, tears the golden brooches from her dress and uses them to stab out his own eyes. The truth is so horrible, so unbearable, that the only response seems to be self-destruction. But here's what's crucially important. Oedipus survives. He doesn't kill himself like Jocasta does. He lives blind, exiled, humiliated, stripped of everything, but alive. And in some later versions of the myth, particularly in Sophocles' final play Oedipus at Colonus, he eventually finds a kind of peace, a hard-won wisdom that only comes through suffering and acceptance. He becomes, in his blindness, a kind of prophet, a source of blessing. This is a profound metaphor for the therapeutic process, for any genuine journey of self-knowledge and healing. When you begin to see truths about yourself, about your family, about your patterns and defenses, it's often extremely painful. You may genuinely wish you hadn't started the journey. You may want to return to comfortable ignorance, to the illusions you held before. There's a moment in therapy that many patients experience, often fairly early in the process. I was better off before I started this. Now I'm more aware of my problems and issues, and that awareness makes me feel worse, not better. This is the Oedipal moment. It's when self-knowledge seems like a curse rather than a blessing, when consciousness feels like a burden rather than a gift. But if you persist, if you have the courage to pass through that dark valley of realization, something shifts and changes. Awareness, even painful awareness, is ultimately better than unconsciousness. Knowing who you are, even if it's uncomfortable or disappointing, is better than living a lie or an illusion. Because only when you see clearly can you choose consciously. Only when you understand your patterns can you have any hope of changing them. Oedipus tears out his own eyes, but paradoxically, it's precisely at that moment when he finally truly sees. Physical blindness becomes a symbol of inner vision, psychological sight. He no longer needs external eyes to perceive the physical world, because now he has developed internal eyes, the capacity to see psychological and spiritual truth. He knows himself completely, without illusion or defense. And there's something genuinely liberating in this, despite all the pain. Oedipus stops running from the truth. He stops trying to be someone he's not. He accepts who he is with all the complexity, with all the tragedy, with all the horror. There's a dignity in this radical acceptance. There's a kind of redemption that comes not from avoiding or denying the truth, but from facing it fully and living with it consciously. Know thyself isn't a casual invitation or a pleasant suggestion. It's a difficult, demanding commandment. It's a call to courage. Because truly, knowing yourself means seeing both the light and the shadow, the good and the bad, the noble and the shameful. It means recognizing your genuine capacities and gifts, but also your real limitations and failures. It means accepting your personal history, even the parts you desperately wish were different, even the parts that cause you shame. In modern therapy, especially in depth-oriented approaches that value consciousness and integration, there's a recognition that the goal isn't necessarily happiness in any superficial sense. The goal is integrity, authenticity, self-knowledge. It's being able to say, with full honesty, I know who I am, I understand why I do what I do, I see my patterns clearly, and from that knowledge, that clarity, I can make conscious choices rather than simply repeating unconscious patterns. This doesn't guarantee a life without pain or difficulty. Oedipus, even after fully accepting his truth, still suffers. His life doesn't become easy, but it's a different kind of suffering. It's not the suffering of ignorance, of self-deception, of constant flight from truth. It's the suffering of consciousness, of clear sight, and that suffering has meaning and dignity. The myth of Oedipus tells us, truth has a price, often a high price, but ignorance also has a price, often a much higher one. It's better to live with eyes open, even if what you see is difficult and painful, than to live blind to yourself, stumbling through life without real understanding or agency. Freud offered one specific interpretation of the myth of Oedipus, focused primarily on repressed sexual desires and family triangles. But this is far from the only possible or valuable interpretation. The myth is rich enough to support multiple readings, and exploring some of them enriches our understanding considerably. First interpretation: Oedipus as the classic tragic hero of Aristotelian drama. In Aristotle's theory of tragedy, which he developed partly through analyzing Sophocles' plays, the tragic hero is someone who is fundamentally good and noble, but who has a crucial flaw or makes a crucial error, a blindness or mistake that leads directly to his downfall. This is called hamartia. What exactly is Oedipus's hamartia? Some interpreters would say it's his hubris, his excessive pride and arrogance. Oedipus believes he can outsmart fate, that he's cleverer than the gods and their prophecies. When the blind prophet Tiresias tries to warn him, tries to get him to stop his investigation, Oedipus responds with insults and accusations. When Jocasta begs him to stop asking questions, to let the past remain buried, he ignores her pleas. His excessive confidence in his own intelligence and his own judgment blinds him to deeper truths, to warnings he should heed. The lesson from this interpretation: there are limits to human control and human understanding. There are mysteries that can't be solved through rational intelligence alone. There are destinies, patterns, forces larger than individual will that we ignore at our peril. It's a message of necessary humility before the complexity and mystery of existence. Second interpretation: Oedipus as detective in the world's first detective story. Several literary critics have noted that the structure of Sophocles' play is remarkably similar to a modern murder mystery or detective novel. Oedipus is investigating a crime, the unsolved murder of Laius, the previous king. He gathers witnesses, cross-references their testimonies, follows clues methodically, pieces together evidence, and gradually, inexorably, the truth emerges. But the murderer he's searching for, the criminal who must be found and punished to save the city, turns out to be himself. He's simultaneously the brilliant detective and the guilty culprit. This structure makes the myth a profound story about the search for truth and the cost of knowledge. Oedipus is absolutely relentless in his investigation. He accepts no half-truths, no comfortable lies. He wants to know everything, whatever the personal cost. It's a story about radical, uncompromising commitment to truth, even when that truth destroys your life. This interpretation resonates powerfully in our current world, where many people seem to prefer comfortable illusions to uncomfortable truths, where denial and willful ignorance are common responses to threatening information. Oedipus challenges us: do you really want to know the truth? Are you willing to investigate relentlessly and honestly, even if the truth you discover is about yourself and is devastating? Third interpretation: the myth as a story about generational curses and intergenerational trauma. Oedipus isn't the first person in his family line to suffer terribly. His father Laius had his own dark and problematic past. In some versions of the myth, Laius kidnapped and sexually abused a young man named Chrysippus, the son of King Pelops, who had shown him hospitality. For this crime of violating guest friendship and abusing a child under his protection, a curse was placed on Laius and all his descendants. Laius's violence and violation echo through the generations. This reading sees the myth as fundamentally about how traumas and sins pass from parents to children to grandchildren. The wounds of one generation become the wounds of the next. Dysfunctional patterns repeat and intensify. Each generation suffers partly for the crimes and mistakes of the previous ones. It's only when someone finally has the courage to fully face the truth, to become completely conscious of the pattern, that the curse can potentially be broken. This interpretation is incredibly relevant to modern psychology and therapy. We now understand that traumas can be transmitted across generations, not just through learned behavior, but through actual biological mechanisms like epigenetic changes, patterns of abuse, neglect, addiction, depression, anxiety can be passed down through family lines unless someone consciously intervenes to heal and transform the pattern. Fourth interpretation: René Girard and the scapegoat mechanism. The French anthropologist and philosopher René Girard developed a fascinating theory about violence, social crisis, and cultural formation. He proposed that when societies fall into crisis, when internal conflicts threaten to tear the community apart, they unconsciously find a scapegoat. someone they can collectively blame and expel or sacrifice. Through this process of identifying a culprit and removing them, social order is temporarily restored. Oedipus, in this reading, functions as the archetypal scapegoat. Thebes is suffering a devastating plague. The crops are failing, people are dying, women cannot give birth successfully. The city is in crisis and needs an explanation, needs someone to blame. Oedipus, the foreigner who became king through cleverness rather than birthright, is the perfect candidate. The revelation of his supposed crimes, his patricide and incest, gives the city exactly what it needs: a guilty party to expel. Through his exile, order is symbolically restored. Girard would see this not primarily as individual psychology, but as social and cultural dynamics. It's about how communities deal with crisis and internal conflict by projecting guilt onto a selected victim. This reading makes us ask uncomfortable questions. How often do we participate in scapegoating? How often do we seek simple explanations and clear villains when facing complex social problems? Fifth interpretation, Deleuze and Guattari's critique of psychoanalysis. The French philosophers Gilles Deleuze and Félix Guattari, in their radical work Anti-Oedipus, launched a powerful critique of Freudian psychoanalysis. They argued that Freud Oedipalized everything, that he reduced all the incredible complexity and diversity of human desire, family structures, and social organization to one single triangle: father, mother, child. For them, this reduction was limiting and even politically repressive. By claiming that all psychological problems ultimately trace back to the Oedipus complex and family dynamics, psychoanalysis effectively ignored and concealed social, political, and economic sources of suffering. It transformed political problems into personal psychological problems. If you're unhappy and struggling, it's not because economic systems are exploitative or social structures are unjust. It's because you have unresolved issues with your father. This critique is important and valuable. It reminds us not to reduce everything to family dynamics and individual psychology. Sometimes the problem genuinely isn't in you or your family of origin. Sometimes the problem is in oppressive social structures, in systems of domination and exploitation, in unjust distributions of power and resources that need to be challenged and changed collectively, not just processed individually in therapy. All these different interpretations demonstrate that the myth of Oedipus is genuinely inexhaustible. It can be read productively in many ways, on many levels, from many angles. There's no single correct interpretation that exhausts the myth's meaning. Each reading illuminates a different aspect of human experience, a different dimension of truth. And perhaps this multiplicity is the mark of truly great myths and great literature. They continue to mean, continue to teach, continue to be relevant and powerful, no matter how many times we return to them, no matter how much our contexts and concerns change. So, we've come to the end of this long journey through the myth of Oedipus and its multiple interpretations, from Freud's controversial theory to modern applications. What do we take with us from this exploration? What can this ancient myth, created in Athens 2,500 years ago, possibly teach us today in the 21st century? First, and most fundamentally, the myth remains relevant and powerful because it speaks to deep, perhaps universal, structures of the human psyche and human experience. Regardless of whether you accept Freud's specific theory of the Oedipus complex with all its sexual implications, all of us must deal with profound questions of identity, separation from parents, construction of autonomy and independence. All of us face the immense challenge of becoming who we really are, separate from family expectations and social conditioning. This is a universal human developmental task. Second, the story of Oedipus is not really, or not primarily, about literal sexual desires for parents. It's about something much larger and more fundamental. It's about consciousness versus unconsciousness. It's about self-knowledge versus self-deception and blindness. It's about the courage necessary to confront difficult and painful truths. It's about the price of knowledge and the value of awareness, even when awareness hurts. Third, all genuine psychological development and growth involves some form of symbolic death. You need to let old versions of yourself die to be born as something new and more authentic. You need to consciously let go of limiting family patterns and inherited ways of being, even when they're familiar and comfortable, in order to discover your own unique patterns and authentic way of living. This process is scary. It's often painful, but it's absolutely necessary for true maturity. Fourth, the critical importance of integrating, not simply repressing or denying, the shadow aspects of the psyche. Oedipus tried desperately to flee from his destiny, but in that very flight, he fulfilled it. What we repress and deny doesn't disappear. It returns, often in destructive ways. What we refuse to look at persists in controlling us from the shadows. The only real way to deal with our shadows, our fears, our difficult and uncomfortable impulses and truths, is to bring them into consciousness, to look at them honestly, to integrate them with compassion and wisdom. Fifth, the patterns we develop in childhood, especially in relation to our parents and primary caregivers, tend to repeat automatically in adult life unless we make them conscious. Unless we do the difficult work of seeing them clearly, understanding them deeply, and actively transforming them. Without this consciousness and intentional work, we're like Oedipus, unconsciously fulfilling destinies we never consciously chose, repeating patterns we don't understand, trapped in cycles we can't break. Sixth, there's a genuine dignity and even liberation in self-knowledge, even when what we come to know is difficult, painful, or shameful. Oedipus, in the end, accepts fully who he is. He stops running from truth. He stops trying to be someone else or to maintain comforting illusions. He takes responsibility, even for actions he committed without full awareness. There's something deeply mature and even noble in this radical acceptance. There's real integrity in being able to say, yes, this is who I am. This is what I've done. This is my story, with all its complexity and pain. Now I must live with this knowledge and find a way forward. Seventh, the therapeutic process, the journey of genuine self-discovery and healing, is Oedipal in the best and deepest sense. It's about investigating honestly and courageously. It's about asking difficult questions and following where they lead, even to uncomfortable places. It's about preferring painful truth to comfortable illusion. It's about transforming blindness into sight, unconsciousness into consciousness, compulsive repetition into conscious choice. So, I want to leave you with some questions for personal reflection. Take a moment to consider. What patterns from your childhood and family of origin are you still unconsciously repeating in your adult life? What aspects of yourself, what truths about your history and your choices are you actively avoiding looking at? What internal parental voices and expectations do you need to transcend and transform to become more fully who you authentically are? In what areas of your life are you acting like Oedipus, blind to obvious truths about yourself that others might see clearly? These are not easy or comfortable questions. The myth of Oedipus reminds us that self-knowledge is not a comfortable or easy path, but it also reminds us powerfully that it's the only real path to freedom, to authenticity, to genuine psychological maturity and wholeness. The invitation that the myth makes to us across thousands of years is this: have the courage to look, have the courage to investigate honestly, have the courage to see who you really are, not who you wish you were, not who you think you should be, not who your parents wanted you to be, not who society expects you to be, but who you actually are underneath all the conditioning and defenses and illusions, who you are with all your complexities, contradictions, wounds, gifts, and potentials. Oedipus, at the end of his terrible journey, eventually finds a kind of peace. Not an easy peace, not a superficial happiness, not a comfortable resolution, but the deep peace that comes from living in truth, from no longer running or hiding, from accepting reality as it is and working consciously with it rather than against it. This is the profound promise of self-knowledge. Not that you'll become perfect, not that your life will be without problems or suffering, not that everything will be easy, but that you'll live consciously, authentically, with integrity, that you'll be present to your own life rather than sleepwalking through it, that you'll make real choices based on real self-understanding rather than simply reacting from unconscious patterns. And that kind of conscious, authentic living, in the end, is absolutely worth the difficult journey required to achieve it. The myth of Oedipus has traveled more than 2,500 years across countless cultures and contexts because it touches something essentially and permanently human, the struggle to know who we truly are, the temptation to flee from that knowledge when it threatens us, the terrible price of ignorance, and the liberating value of consciousness and truth. This struggle didn't end in ancient Greece with Sophocles. It's happening right now, in every life, in every generation, in every person who has the courage to ask, who am I really? Freud saw something true and important, even if his specific interpretation was limited and culturally bound. He saw that there's a fundamental psychological drama that every person needs to navigate. A drama of separation from origins, discovery of identity, integration of shadow, and movement toward maturity. He may have focused too narrowly on sexual dynamics and missed other crucial dimensions, but he recognized that this ancient myth encoded deep truths about human development. And perhaps the greatest and most unsettling lesson of the myth is simply this: you cannot escape from yourself. You cannot outrun your own unconscious patterns and unresolved issues. Oedipus tried with all his considerable intelligence and will to flee from his destiny, and he ran straight into it at every turn. We try to flee from our patterns, our wounds, our fears, our shadows, and they catch up with us. They manifest in our relationships, our choices, our symptoms, our repeated mistakes. The only way out is through. The only cure is consciousness. The only real freedom comes from truth, however painful. So if you take away just one thing from this video, let it be this: self-knowledge is not a luxury. It's not an optional hobby. It's not something to pursue if you happen to have extra time and energy. It's the essential task of a human life lived consciously. It's the work that Oedipus failed to do until life forced him into it catastrophically. It's the work that all of us are called to do if we want to live authentically and fully. And yes, it will hurt sometimes. It will be uncomfortable and challenging. It will question things you thought you knew for certain. It will disrupt comfortable illusions. But on the other side of that difficult journey is something genuinely precious. The real possibility of living as who you truly are. Not as an unconscious echo of your parents. Not as a product of social conditioning and expectations. Not as a collection of defensive reactions and compensatory strategies. But as yourself, unique, authentic, whole, conscious, and free. This is the invitation that the myth of Oedipus, crossing millennia, still urgently makes to us today. Have the courage to know yourself. Have the courage to see clearly. Have the courage to live in truth, whatever that truth turns out to be. Thank you for watching and for staying with me through this deep exploration. If this video resonated with you, if it sparked reflections and insights, if it made you think differently about your own journey and patterns, please leave a comment sharing your thoughts and experiences. Subscribe to the channel for more explorations of how ancient myths illuminate modern psychology and the human condition. And most importantly, continue your own journey of self-knowledge, continue asking the difficult questions, continue looking honestly, even when it's uncomfortable. Continue choosing consciousness over comfortable unconsciousness, because in the end, as Oedipus eventually and painfully discovered, truth genuinely liberates, not in the way we expected or hoped, not without cost or suffering, but genuinely, deeply, permanently, it liberates. It sets us free to be who we really are. Until the next video,